The morning air carried the hum of the city, a rhythm Margaret Hayes had grown accustomed to over the years. She stood at her usual spot near the corner of Elmwood and Jefferson. A small table set with her handmade trinkets and neatly packaged snacks. The sun was already climbing, warming the sidewalk beneath her sturdy shoes. This was her routine, her quiet way of staying connected to the world. Margaret wasn't one to seek attention. Her life had been a series of quiet acts, teaching, raising a family, and, in these later years, selling her modest wares to passers-by. She didn't mind the indifference of the crowd. The way people walked briskly past her table, their gazes fixed on their phones or the distant horizon. It was the occasional smile, the brief exchanges of, "How are you today, Mrs. Hayes?" that made her mornings worthwhile. Across the street, cars rolled by in an endless stream, their tires hissing softly on the pavement. Margaret adjusted the brim of her wide hat to shield her eyes from the glare of the sun. Her hands, weathered and strong, moved with practiced ease as she arranged her table, ensuring every item had its place. It was then she noticed him, the man in the gray suit. He had been pacing on the opposite sidewalk for some time, his phone pressed to his ear. His movements were sharp, restless, like he carried the weight of the world in his briefcase. Margaret had seen men like him before. Businessmen in a hurry, always checking their watches, their footsteps too brisk for her small offerings. But this one was different. His gaze kept flickering toward her, a flash of irritation breaking through his otherwise composed demeanor. Margaret felt it before he even crossed the street, the tightness in his expression. The way he clutched his phone just a bit too tightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the street. He didn't wait for her to respond. "Do you have a permit for this? You can't just set up shop here. This is public space." Margaret looked up at him, her face calm, betraying nothing of the irritation she felt rising in her chest. "Good morning to you too, sir," she said evenly, her voice soft but firm. "I've been here for years. Never had a problem before." The man frowned, his eyes narrowing as if her words had only confirmed his suspicions. "Well, there's a first time for everything," he muttered, already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the authorities. This is unacceptable." Margaret said nothing. She had seen this before, the assumptions, the immediate need to assert control. She could feel the eyes of others on her now, the quiet weight of the crowd's curiosity pressing against her back. But she didn't look up. Instead, she turned to adjust a small stack of bracelets on her table. Her hands steady, her heart quietly sinking. The man's voice rose above the street's steady hum as he spoke to someone on the other end of the line. Words like disruption and disturbance floated through the air, drawing murmurs from the growing crowd. Margaret remained silent, her mind wandering briefly to her students from years ago. Would they recognize her now, standing here under the scrutiny of a stranger's judgment? Would they remember the lessons she had taught them about fairness and understanding? The man snapped his phone shut, his expression triumphant. "The police are on their way," he declared to no one in particular. "This kind of behavior shouldn't be tolerated." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she finally spoke. "Sir, I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just here to make an honest living." The man scoffed, crossing his arms as if her words were beneath him. "That's not for you to decide," he said coldly. Margaret nodded slowly, her hands returning to her work, her movements deliberate and measured. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a quiet tension settling over the corner of Elmwood and Jefferson. And yet, amidst the noise, Margaret's heart remained still, waiting for what was to come. The street corner felt heavier now, as if the air had thickened under the weight of silent stares and unspoken judgments. Margaret Hayes remained at her table, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her worn wooden tray. Around her, the world moved on, cars passed, horns blared, and the faint strains of a street performer's saxophone drifted from down the block. Yet, in her small corner, time seemed to slow. Ethan Caldwell, the man in the gray suit, stood a few paces away, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His phone call had ended, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud, darkening the space between them. He didn't look at her now, his gaze darting between his watch and the street. waiting. The murmurs of the crowd were soft but persistent. Like the low tide lapping at the shore. A young couple whispered to each other, stealing glances at Margaret. An older man with a cane stood a few feet away, his brow furrowed in quiet disapproval. No one spoke directly to Margaret, but their curiosity was palpable. She felt it in the way they lingered, their steps slowing as they passed, their heads turning just enough to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. Margaret had learned long ago to recognize these moments. The subtle ways prejudice revealed itself. It wasn't always loud or overt. Sometimes it was a quiet tension, a questioning glance, or a deliberate avoidance of eye contact. Today, it took the shape of a well-dressed man who believed she didn't belong. She glanced at her table, at the small assortment of bracelets, hand-carved wooden trinkets, and neatly wrapped cookies she had baked the night before. They sat there, unassuming and harmless, yet somehow they had become the center of a conflict she hadn't asked for. Margaret's gaze shifted back to Ethan. His impatience was clear in the way he shifted his weight, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement. He was the kind of man who expected the world to move at his pace, who believed his words carried the weight of authority. And now, he had summoned that authority to her doorstep. A police car pulled up to the curb, its lights off, but its presence unmistakable. Two officers stepped out, their movements measured, their expressions neutral. They scanned the scene, their eyes moving from Ethan to Margaret and back again. The younger officer, tall and broad-shouldered, approached first, while his partner hung back, observing. "Sir, you called us?" the younger officer asked, his tone polite but firm. Ethan straightened, the tension in his posture easing as he stepped forward. "Yes, I did. This woman," he gestured toward Margaret without looking at her, "is setting up shop here without a permit. She's causing a disturbance, and it's not appropriate for this area." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "And what kind of disturbance is she causing?" "Well," Ethan hesitated for a moment, his confidence faltering under the officer's steady gaze. "It's not the kind of activity that should be allowed here. This is a busy area." And, he stopped short, as if realizing his words were spilling into uncomfortable territory. The officer turned to Margaret, his demeanor softening slightly. "Ma'am, is this your stand?" Margaret met his gaze, her voice steady. "It is, officer. I've been selling here for years. Never had any trouble before." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes sweeping over the neatly arranged table. He glanced back at his partner, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze, who had been watching the exchange silently. The older officer stepped forward then, his steps purposeful, his face thoughtful. "Margaret Hayes?" he asked, his voice low, almost uncertain. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing as she studied the man. Recognition dawned slowly, like the morning sun breaking through a foggy horizon. "Yes," she said quietly. "Do I know you?" The officer smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through his professional exterior. "You might not remember me," he said, his voice steady, "but I remember you. You were my teacher 5th grade. At Jefferson Elementary." Margaret's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "James Carter," she said after a moment, the name falling from her lips like an old song she hadn't sung in years. "I do remember you." The younger officer glanced between them, his brow furrowed in confusion. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The quiet tension of the scene deepened, the unspoken truths of the situation lingering in the air like an uninvited guest. James Carter turned to his partner, then back to Ethan. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it now. A quiet authority born not from his badge but from his own understanding of the moment. "I think we need to take a closer look at what's really happening here." Margaret remained silent, her gaze steady as the world around her shifted in ways she couldn't yet predict. The quiet struggle between perception and reality had only just begun. The quiet hum of the street corner turned into a muted stillness, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the distant honk of a car horn. The two officers now stood with Margaret Hayes and Ethan Caldwell at the center of an unspoken tension. The younger officer, Officer Danvers, maintained a careful distance, his eyes flickering from his partner to the scene unfolding before him. Officer James Carter, the older of the two, seemed to carry the weight of the moment differently. His recognition of Margaret had shifted the air, though his expression remained composed. There was something unspoken in his movements, a mix of respect and hesitancy, as though the lines between duty and memory had blurred. Ethan, however, was less subtle. His discomfort was evident in the way he shifted his weight, his gaze darting around the gathering crowd. The authority he had so confidently wielded moments earlier seemed to falter, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. Still, he straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Officers, I'm sure you'll agree this situation needs addressing," he said, his tone clipped but strained. James glanced at him, his face unreadable. "What exactly do you think needs addressing, sir?" Ethan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "Well, as I said before, this setup." He gestured vaguely at Margaret's small table. "It's disruptive. It's not appropriate for a public space like this." James looked down at the table, his eyes scanning the modest display of bracelets and baked goods. Nothing about it seemed out of place. Margaret's items were carefully arranged, her table spotless. It was as though every detail had been crafted not to draw attention but to blend into the rhythm of the city. "And how is it disruptive?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan faltered, his expression tightening. "It's just look. This is a professional area. It's not a place for street vendors." Margaret's hands rested lightly on the edge of her table, her eyes steady but distant, as though she were watching the scene from a place far removed. She didn't speak, letting the moment unfold without her interruption. Years of experience had taught her the power of silence, the way it could strip away the layers of pretense and force others to confront their own words. "Mrs. Hayes," James said gently, turning toward her, "how long have you been selling here?" Margaret met his gaze, her voice soft but unwavering. 10 years, Officer Carter. I've been coming here almost every day since I retired. People know me. Some even look forward to seeing me here." James nodded slowly, his own memories of Margaret, the firm but kind teacher who had helped him through his struggles in 5th grade, resurfaced with unexpected clarity. He remembered the way she had spoken to him, not as a child but as a person capable of understanding and growth. It was the kind of respect he rarely saw given, especially to someone like him at that age. "You mentioned you retired," James said, his tone conversational. "What did you do before?" "I was a teacher," Margaret replied, her voice steady. 35 years at Jefferson Elementary. I taught just about every subject at some point." The murmurs from the crowd grew slightly louder, a ripple of recognition spreading through those who had gathered. A young woman near the back of the group whispered to her friend, "I think she taught my brother." An older man nodded slowly, his expression softening as though piecing together a memory he hadn't thought of in years. Ethan's face reddened slightly, his previous certainty now visibly unraveling. "That doesn't change the fact that she's still here without permission." James turned back to him, his gaze steady. "Sir, you called us because you believed this was a disturbance. From what I see, Mrs. Hayes isn't disturbing anyone. If anything, she's been contributing to this community for decades." Ethan opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, his words catching in his throat. The weight of the crowd's silence pressed against him now, their collective gaze a mirror reflecting his own discomfort back at him. James's partner, Officer Danvers, stepped forward then, breaking the quiet. "Carter," he said, his voice low but audible enough for the crowd to hear. "Looks like we've got a lot of people here who recognize her. Maybe we ought to listen to them too." James nodded, his expression softening as he turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry for any trouble this has caused you today. You're not breaking any laws, as far as I can see. But I'd like to hear from the people here. Is there anyone who can speak to Mrs. Hayes's contributions to the neighborhood?" The question hung in the air for a moment. And then, slowly, hands began to rise. A man near the front spoke first. "She used to teach my daughter," he said, "helped her get through some rough times in school. I didn't even know she was still around." A woman chimed in, her voice firm. "She's been here as long as I've lived in the area. Always polite, always kind." The voices grew louder, one by one, until they formed a quiet chorus of support. Ethan stood silently now, his shoulders hunched slightly, his confidence eroded. Margaret said nothing, her eyes steady as she listened. She had not asked for this defense, but she accepted it with the quiet dignity that had always defined her. As the officers stepped back to discuss their next steps, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't victory she felt, but something deeper, a sense of belonging, of being seen. Whatever the outcome of this day, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk where Margaret Hayes stood. The murmurs of the crowd had softened, giving way to an air of quiet reflection. People lingered not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something deeper, a need to bear witness. Margaret, with her weathered hands and gentle presence, had become the unexpected center of a story larger than herself. Officer James Carter, still standing near Margaret's table, seemed to hesitate as if searching for the right words. His partner, Officer Danvers, watched silently, arms folded, while Ethan Caldwell stood a few steps away, his confidence visibly fraying. The crowd, now less of an audience and more of a community, waited. James cleared his throat, his voice softer than before. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his gaze steady, "you said you were a teacher for 35 years. Did you ever think your work would bring you here? To this moment?" Margaret looked at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I didn't think much about where life would take me, Officer Carter," she said. "I just tried to do right by the children in my care. That was always enough for me." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The crowd seemed to lean into them, as though seeking a glimpse of the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of service. James nodded slowly, his thoughts briefly wandering back to his own time in her classroom. "I remember you used to have that old chalkboard," he said, a faint smile crossing his face. "You wrote a quote on it every week. Something for us to think about." Margaret's eyes brightened, a flicker of memory lighting her face. "That's right. I believed in starting each week with a bit of wisdom. Something the children could carry with them, even if they forgot everything else I taught." James laughed softly. "I didn't forget. One of them stuck with me all these years. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." Maya Angelou, wasn't it? Margaret nodded, her smile widening. "That was one of my favorites." The crowd murmured in quiet agreement, the words resonating with an unexpected power. Even Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. It was as if the quote had found its mark, not as a rebuke but as an invitation to reflection. A woman stepped forward then, her voice breaking the stillness. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her tone hesitant but warm. "I think you taught my brother. His name's Michael Anders. He always said you were the one who helped him stay in school." Margaret's expression softened. "Michael was a bright boy," she said. "He just needed someone to remind him of that." The woman nodded, her face lighting up with gratitude. "He's a teacher now too. He always says it's because of you." Other voices followed, one by one, until they blended into a quiet chorus. Former students, parents, and neighbors shared their stories, small, personal moments that painted a picture of a life lived in quiet service. Each story felt like a thread, weaving together a tapestry of community, belonging, and legacy. Ethan stood apart, his face flushed as he listened. The weight of the crowd's testimony seemed to press against him, forcing him to confront the unspoken assumptions that had brought him here. He glanced at Margaret's table again, at the simple wares that had sparked his initial complaint. It all seemed so small now, so insignificant in the face of what she had given to the world. James turned back to Ethan, his voice calm but firm. "Sir," he said, "do you still feel Mrs. Hayes is causing a disturbance?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze shifting between James and Margaret. For a moment, he seemed ready to argue, to reclaim the authority he had wielded so easily earlier. But the words didn't come. Instead, he lowered his eyes, his shoulders slumping slightly. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had gripped the street corner beginning to ease. Margaret, however, said nothing. Her hands rested on the edge of her table, steady and patient. as though she had been expecting this all along. James stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I think it's clear you're not just part of this community. You've helped build it. People like you make neighborhoods what they are." Margaret nodded slowly, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you, Officer Carter. But I'm just one person. It's the people around me who make this community worth being part of." The simplicity of her words struck a chord, resonating with a power that no argument or debate could match. The crowd began to disperse then, some offering quiet words of support as they passed. Margaret returned their smiles with gentle nods, her heart quietly full. As the officers prepared to leave, James lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Margaret's. "You were right about that quote," he said, "about knowing better and doing better. I think a lot of us learned something today." Margaret's smile was small but warm. "That's all any of us can do, James. Just keep learning." The moment passed, the quiet wisdom of her words settling into the hearts of those who had heard them. For Margaret, it was just another day on the corner. But for those who had gathered, it was a reminder of the quiet power of understanding, and the legacy of a life lived with purpose. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving Margaret Hayes alone at her table once again. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light on the street, softening the edges of the buildings and painting long shadows across the pavement. The energy of the morning confrontation had faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. Margaret took a sip of water from a small bottle she kept tucked behind her table, her hands steady but her thoughts restless. Ethan Caldwell stood a short distance away, his polished shoes scuffing against the pavement as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He hadn't left with the others, though it was clear he was unsure what to do next. His gaze flickered toward Margaret, then away, as though he were wrestling with thoughts too heavy to articulate. Margaret noticed him lingering but didn't speak. She had no desire to chastise him or demand an apology. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, offering him the space to confront his own discomfort. It was a tactic she had used often as a teacher, giving her students the opportunity to find their own answers, to reflect before speaking. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat and took a hesitant step forward. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharpness it had carried earlier. I owe you an apology." Margaret looked up, her expression calm but curious. "Do you?" she asked, her tone neither accusatory nor forgiving. It was a genuine question, one that left the responsibility of explanation squarely in his hands. Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the sidewalk. "I think I do," he said after a moment. "I assumed things about you, about what you were doing here, without really knowing anything. And I was wrong." Margaret nodded slowly, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her table. "What made you change your mind?" she asked, her voice as steady as ever. Ethan looked up at her, his expression conflicted. "I heard what people said about you," he admitted. "The stories about how you helped them, how much you've given to this community. It made me realize how little I understood about you. About this place." He paused, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and regret. "I let my assumptions get in the way." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what do you think now?" Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I think I was too quick to judge. I saw something that didn't fit my idea of what this neighborhood should look like, and I reacted without thinking about why. That's on me." For a long moment, Margaret didn't respond. She simply watched him, her gaze steady but not unkind. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "It's easy to make assumptions, Mr. Caldwell. We all did. The hard part is recognizing them and choosing to do better." Ethan nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "I'm trying," he said. "I know that doesn't fix what I did, but I am trying." Margaret offered him a small, understanding smile. "That's a start," she said. "We all have room to grow." The quiet exchange felt like a turning point, not just for Ethan but for the atmosphere of the street corner itself. There was no dramatic resolution, no applause or public declaration of forgiveness. Just two people standing in the soft afternoon light, acknowledging the weight of their shared humanity. As Ethan prepared to leave, he hesitated once more, turning back to Margaret. If there's anything I can do to help you, he said, his tone earnest, please let me know. Margaret nodded, her smile widening slightly. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Just keep learning. That's help enough. Ethan nodded in return, his steps slower now as he walked away, the tension in his shoulders replaced by a quiet humility. Margaret watched him go, her thoughts drifting back to the many times she had seen similar moments of growth in her students. It was never easy to confront one's own biases, but it was always necessary. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Margaret leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the evening settle over her. The day had been long, and the challenges had been many, but she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The work of teaching, of guiding others toward understanding, was never truly done. Even now, long after she had left the classroom, the lessons continued, and so, Margaret sat at her table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, content in the knowledge that change, however small, was always possible. The morning after the confrontation, Margaret Hayes arrived at her usual spot on the corner of Elmwood and Jefferson. Her table neatly arranged as always. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the pavement. It felt like an ordinary day, but as Margaret set down her chair and adjusted her hat, she couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. She noticed it first in the way people greeted her. A young man jogging past paused to say, "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," with a warm smile. A woman pushing a stroller stopped to buy a bracelet and stayed to chat, her voice brimming with kindness. These gestures were small, but they carried a weight that Margaret hadn't expected. A quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, of her presence, her history, her worth. By mid-morning, the trickle of visitors had grown into something more deliberate. Familiar faces from the neighborhood began to appear, former students, parents, and even strangers who had heard about what had happened the day before. They came not to confront or question, but to thank her. "Mrs. Hayes," one man said, his voice tinged with emotion. "You taught my little brother years ago. He still talks about how you helped him find his love for reading. I just wanted to say, thank you." Margaret's hands stilled on the bracelet she was tying. She looked up at the man, her eyes softening. "It was always my pleasure," she said simply, her voice steady. As the hours passed, the small acts of gratitude began to take on a life of their own. Someone brought coffee and pastries, insisting Margaret take a break to enjoy them. Another person set up a folding chair nearby and began sharing stories of how Margaret had impacted the community. The atmosphere was warm, almost celebratory, but Margaret remained grounded, her quiet demeanor anchoring the moment. Then, just before noon, Margaret noticed something unusual. A small group of people had gathered near the end of the street, carrying signs and balloons. At the front of the group stood Officer James Carter, dressed in plain clothes, holding a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like a speech. Margaret tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "What are you up to, James?" she muttered under her breath as the group approached. "Mrs. Hayes," James called out, his voice carrying across the street. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, his expression both solemn and warm. "I hope you don't mind, but we wanted to do something to show our appreciation." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her table. "I'm not sure I deserve all this fuss," she said, her tone light but sincere. James shook his head. "With all due respect, Mrs. Hayes, you do, and then some." He unfolded the piece of paper in his hands and cleared his throat. "Today, we want to honor someone who has been a cornerstone of our community for decades. Margaret Hayes has not only educated generations of students but has also shown us the quiet strength of kindness, resilience, and integrity. Her presence reminds us of the values that bind us together: respect, compassion, and the willingness to listen and learn." The crowd erupted into applause, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm as she bowed her head slightly, a rare flush of self-consciousness overtaking her usual composure. James continued, his voice steady. "Margaret Hayes, on behalf of this community, we want to thank you for everything you've done and everything you continue to do. You've made this neighborhood a better place, and we're all better for having you in it." As the applause swelled again, Margaret looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces that had gathered. She saw former students now grown, parents she hadn't spoken to in years, neighbors who had once been strangers but now smiled at her like old friends. And standing at the back, slightly apart from the rest, was Ethan Caldwell. His expression was hard to read, but there was no mistaking the quiet respect in his posture. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying over the applause. "This means more to me than I can put into words. But I want you all to know that anything I've done, anything I've given to this community has been a privilege. It's not just about what one person can do, it's about what we can do together." The crowd quieted, the weight of her words settling over them like a gentle breeze. Margaret's gaze swept the group, her heart full yet steady. She had spent her life teaching, guiding, and giving what she could. But moments like these reminded her that she had received just as much in return. As the gathering began to wind down, people lingered to share their thanks and their stories. Margaret listened, her presence calm and unwavering, as though the events of the day had only deepened her roots in the community. And when the last person had departed, leaving her alone once more at her table, she sat down with a quiet smile. The day wasn't extraordinary in the way most people imagined. There were no grand speeches or dramatic gestures, no sweeping changes that would make the news. But it was extraordinary in its simplicity, a testament to the quiet power of acknowledgement, of gratitude, and of seeing one another for who we truly are. The evening sunlight stretched long across the street corner, its golden hues softening the edges of the day's events. Margaret Hayes sat quietly at her table, the hum of the city around her once again settling into its familiar rhythm. The crowd had dispersed, leaving behind a sense of calm, but also something unspoken and unfinished conversation that lingered like the last notes of a song. It was in this stillness that Ethan Caldwell returned. His earlier confidence, polished and sharp, had given way to something quieter. He approached her table hesitantly, his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. Margaret watched him with her usual calm, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her table. "Waiting. Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice softer than before. "Do you mind if I sit for a moment?" Margaret gestured to the folding chair someone had left behind earlier. "Be my guest," she said simply, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Ethan sat down, his movements careful, as though he didn't want to disturb the air around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the street filled the silence, a car door slamming in the distance, the faint laughter of children playing somewhere nearby. It was Margaret who finally broke the quiet. "What brings you back, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the pavement. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his tone heavy with sincerity. "I know I already said it earlier, but I don't think I really understood how much harm I caused. Not just to you, but to myself, too." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. "To yourself?" she repeated, her curiosity genuine. Ethan nodded, finally meeting her gaze. "When I acted the way I did yesterday, it wasn't just about you. It was about the way I've been looking at the world. I've spent so much time assuming things about people, who they are, what they're worth, without ever stopping to ask myself why. It's like I've been carrying these blinders, and I didn't even know they were there." Margaret listened, her expression thoughtful. "And what do you see now?" she asked quietly. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I see that I was wrong," he said. "I see that you're someone who's given more to this community than I ever have. And I see that it's not enough to just say I'm sorry. I need to do better to be better." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "It's a hard thing, recognizing our own faults," she said, "but it's the first step toward change. What matters is what you do next." Ethan looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. "It feels overwhelming." Margaret's smile was small but warm. "Start small," she said. "Open your eyes, listen more than you speak, and remember that everyone has a story. The rest will come with time." Ethan nodded, her words settling into him like seeds planted in fertile soil. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation balanced by the simplicity of the moment. There was no dramatic resolution, no sweeping declaration of redemption, just the quiet understanding that change, however small, had begun. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Ethan stood to leave. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "Not just for today, but for everything you've done for this community. And now, for me." Margaret inclined her head, her smile widening just a fraction. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Caldwell," she said, "and remember change starts with one step." Ethan nodded and walked away, his steps slower, more deliberate, as though he carried a lighter burden now. Margaret watched him go, her thoughts a quiet mixture of hope and reflection. She had seen moments like this before. Moments where understanding cracked through the surface of ignorance like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't always immediate, and it wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. For Margaret, it was a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, the possibility for growth and reconciliation remained. As the streetlights flickered on and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret packed up her table for the day. The city moved around her, unchanged in many ways, but she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not for herself, but for the small steps forward, steps that might one day lead to something larger. And so, with her bag over her shoulder and her head held high, Margaret made her way home, leaving the corner of Elmwood and Jefferson behind for the night. But she knew she would return, as she always did, ready to meet whatever the next day would bring. The dawn brought a soft, golden light to the streets, the kind of light that held promise in its quiet warmth. Margaret Hayes returned to her usual spot on the corner of Elmwood and Jefferson, her table neatly arranged as always. The city moved around her as it had for years, people hurrying past, cars rumbling over the pavement, and the occasional greeting from a familiar face. It was the rhythm of her life, steady and unchanging, and yet, something felt different. Margaret unfolded her chair, settled into her seat, and surveyed the day ahead. The events of the past few days lingered in her mind, not as burdens but as quiet reminders of the world's complexities. Prejudice, she knew, wasn't something that vanished overnight. It was woven into the fabric of society, often unnoticed until it snagged on something or someone like her. As the morning wore on, the neighborhood began to stir. A young boy with a backpack stopped at her table, his eyes wide as he examined the colorful bracelets she had arranged. Margaret smiled, handing him one with a small charm shaped like a star. "For good luck," she said softly. The boy grinned and ran off, his small feet pattering against the pavement. Moments like these grounded her. They reminded her why she had spent decades teaching and why she continued to return to this corner every day. It wasn't about the money or the routine. It was about connection, about the small, human moments that built bridges where walls had once stood. By midday, Margaret noticed Ethan Caldwell walking toward her. He wasn't in his usual suit today, and his step seemed lighter, less hurried. When he reached her table, he smiled a genuine, unguarded smile and held out a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "I thought you might like this." Margaret took the cup, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm. "That's very kind of you." He stayed for a moment, his hands in his pockets, as though he wasn't sure what to say next. Finally, he glanced at her table and gestured to the bracelets. "Do you mind if I buy one of those? For my daughter," he added quickly. "She loves handmade things." Margaret nodded, selecting a delicate bracelet with soft blue beads. "This one," she said, handing it to him. "It's simple, but thoughtful. I think she'll like it." Ethan took it, his expression thoughtful. "She will," he said. "Thank you." As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him. "Mr. Caldwell." He paused, looking back at her. "You're taking your first steps," she said. "That's what matters." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I won't forget," he said, and with that, he disappeared into the bustling crowd. The rest of the day passed quietly, the kind of quiet Margaret cherished. She sold a few more trinkets, exchanged pleasantries with passers-by, and listened to the ebb and flow of the city around her. It was an ordinary day. Yet it held the weight of something deeper, a sense of progress. However small, and the hope that it would continue. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Margaret packed up her table. Her movements slow and deliberate. She felt the familiar ache in her hands. The kind that came with age and a lifetime of work. But it didn't bother her. It was a reminder that she was still here. Still contributing. Still moving forward. On her way home, she passed a group of teenagers gathered near the park. They were laughing and talking, their voices carrying on the breeze. One of them turned and called out, "Good night, Mrs. Hayes." She smiled, raising a hand in acknowledgement. "Good night," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for them to hear. When she reached her door, Margaret paused, looking back at the street behind her. The world hadn't changed overnight. But it had shifted, if only slightly, and that, she knew, was how change began, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet moments of understanding. As she stepped inside, the warmth of her home embracing her, Margaret Hayes felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't need recognition or applause. She needed only the knowledge that she had lived her life with purpose. That her small corner of the world was better for her having been in it. And that, she thought, was enough.